Hi, everyone. Welcome to our program. We're going to get started in just a few moments. Thanks for joining us. We have well over 200 people signed up for the program this morning, so everyone's in good company, and really appreciate you taking time for this program. So hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to get started in just a moment, just waiting for more people to join us. So hang in there for another minute, and then we'll get started. All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to a special webinar covering new strategies for cost reduction in a post-COVID-19 world. This program is brought to you by a partnership of Private Equity Professional, which is the industry's news leader since 2007, and Private Equity Career News, the weekly newsletter on job opportunities, compensation, and fundraising. Today's program is sponsored by Alliance Cost Containment. The company is the leader in reducing operating costs and increasing shareholder value for private equity firms. My name is David Toll. I'm the publisher of Private Equity Career News, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's program. I'm very grateful to have 4 expert speakers here today who can guide you through the topic and answer your most pressing questions. Kicking things off today will be Miles Lee, Chief Executive Officer at Alliance Cost Containment. Miles will give a presentation discussing best practices in reducing non-core procurement costs. That will be followed by a general Q&A discussion with all 4 speakers, including Andrew Braithwaite, Managing Director of the Sinisher Group, Michael Lynch, Chief Financial Officer of the Fire King Security Group, and Don Sturdivant, Operating Partner at private equity firm Snow Phipps. During the discussion period, we will address questions that you asked when you signed up for the program over the past several weeks, and we can also address new questions that you post through the question feature on your control panel. So please do that, and we'll take questions throughout the entire span of the program. Now, before we get to the formal presentation, a few housekeeping announcements. First of all, everyone who has registered for today's program will receive a link to a recording of the program by email within a few hours of the end of the program, so look for that. Those of you who would like just the slide presentation can request that directly from their creator, Miles Lee. His email address is mlee@alliancecost.com. That's mlee@alliancecost.com, and he'll give that email address a little later in the program as well if you missed it. So let me now turn the program over to Miles Lee of Alliance Cost Containment for his formal presentation. Miles?
Thank you, David, and good morning, everybody. Looks like we have a great turnout this morning with more than 225 people signed up. And I really appreciate your taking the time to participate in our webinar. The topic, as David mentioned, is indirect cost reduction for private equity firms in the COVID-19 environment that we're in. I'd also like to thank Don, Andrew, and Mike for serving as panelists and sharing their perspectives as longtime and valued clients of Alliance Cost Containment. First, a brief introduction. So I'm Miles Lee, CEO of ACC. ACC assists our clients with EBITDA improvement through the reduction of indirect procurement expenses. And we typically work with clients with more than 100 million in annual revenue, and we're often connected to these clients through relationships that we established with mid-market PE firms, such as the ones that are represented on the panel. For today's webinar, I'm going to start off with a few remarks about indirect procurement expenses, highlight some common misconceptions, best practices, and also discuss some of the COVID-19 impacts that we see as it relates to indirect procurement. As David mentioned, we will then answer questions submitted from the participants and hopefully have a nice collaborative discussion. So ACC offers 3 services to private equity firms. The first is analytical support as part of a PE firm's due diligence. And in this area, we help the PE firm project the future cost takeout potential during the pre-acquisition stage. We'll go in the data room, collect all the relevant data, do a deep dive analysis, and project out a range of savings that we think could be achievable if our client, the PE firm, moves forward with the acquisition. The second service is our core offering, which is implementing meaningful cost reduction and EBITDA improvement in up to 35 different expense areas, categories, which we'll talk about. And then the third is measuring and auditing the savings that's been implemented to validate the increased enterprise valuations to be realized during the exit phase. So we cover the full life cycle of pre-acquisition, the holding period, and the exit phase. While we do these services as standalone, we often provide all 3 during the course of a typical engagement as part of our deliverable. Here's a list of a type of indirect expenses we manage for our clients. These 30+ expense categories can comprise anywhere from 10 to 50% of all dollars spent with third-party suppliers, depending on an industry a company's in. So, manufacturing and distribution companies are typically going to have a higher percentage of indirect spend, while retail, service, and technology companies tend to fall on the lower end. But either way, most companies consider these non-core, non-mission critical costs. However, in the aggregate, they can have a significantly meaningful impact on EBITDA and enterprise valuation if managed effectively. There are some common misconceptions about indirect costs. First, some assume that the overall savings potential is low, since these are non-core items, or maybe it's not worth the time or effort to focus on them. Additionally, some companies feel like they already have the house in order and there is no room for savings. Our view is there's always room for improvement given the sheer volume of recurring expenses and multitude of competitive supplier choices. And I'm going to briefly go through a couple of case studies to make that point. So David, if we could go to the first case study. Next slide. There we go. This one is a $450 million manufacturing company owned by a mid-market PE firm. This client was a platform investment for the PE firm that had multiple add-ons during our engagement. And you can see some of the high impact savings areas such as maintenance, repair, and operational, tooling, products, plastics, freight, packaging, and telecommunications. So this company was very effective at managing its raw material purchases, but quite honestly didn't have the resources to apply the same level of detail to the indirect costs. So as a result, we worked with them closely and delivered over $3 million in annual savings. And more importantly, after the fees and costs associated with implementing that savings, the net enterprise value creation using a conservative 7x multiple was approximately $25 million. So that's a nice result. It took our team about 6 months. We had a team of 7 or 8 people on the project. It took us about 6 months to generate this result. And our fees were based on realized savings. So the risk reward ratio for the client in this example was quite favorable. So David, next slide. Okay. This slide shows a network effect for a private equity firm. Once the results are achieved with 1 or 2 companies inside a portfolio, the sponsors can take a more systematic approach and almost calendarize cost reduction efforts. So in this example, we worked with 3 companies initially, which led to the scheduled onboarding of essentially one new portfolio company per quarter and their add-ons during the process. So in this example, again, using the conservative multiple, there was approximately $70 to $80 million in total enterprise value that's created after costs and implementation expenses across all 8 companies. And obviously, as with that type of result, you continue to work on new companies as they come into the mix. And you may be aware that many of the larger PE firms like Carlyle and KKR have internal teams on their staff whose sole focus is cost takeout for the portfolio companies. Our target is mid-market PE firms that really don't have the internal resources to be able to do this in-house and rely on us as a trusted advisor. So I'm going to shift now to some of the best practices that PE firms and their portfolios companies can consider. Some of these are probably very obvious to some of you. Even so, they're important to highlight as a reminder if you want to implement a successful cost takeout throughout your portfolio. You know, first and foremost, if you're interested in rolling out a successful cost takeout initiative, it's critically important for it to be a high priority at the C-suite. Some of our most successful engagements are based on strong CEO, CFO commitment, not just one-time cost reduction, but continual savings and efficiency. So kind of using the analogy of personal fitness, the people who commit to daily or weekly exercise are going to generally be the healthiest and most fit. Similarly, some companies view cost reduction either as a once-a-year exercise or maybe once every 2 years or worse. They really don't prioritize it. Obviously, those are companies that are leaving the most money on the table and more than likely have the most inefficiencies, you know, inherent throughout their organization. So we firmly believe, you know, the committed C-suite to kind of make it in the DNA that cost reduction is an ongoing process, not a once or twice a year exercise. David, next slide, please. Another best practice tip relates to measurement. Most companies measure procurement spend by vendor or by category of expense. We don't think that goes far enough. It's imperative to, in our view, to audit the line item spending underneath each category, much like you would analyze sales revenue by product line. As I mentioned, we generate monthly savings audits for our clients that are analyzed at the SKU level. Our average monthly audit typically contains over 100 pages of detail and is, you know, 2 or 3 inches thick, and that's each month. And it covers all the detail of the, you know, kind of the hard to read information that's on this screen, but it's literally every dollar spent that's under our management on a monthly basis. We're tracking it, making sure it matches the benchmark of low cost savings that was established on the front end. So we believe firmly, and you'll see in a couple of examples, that measuring at the category or the supplier level doesn't give you the full picture. This case study briefly is a $20 billion publicly traded client of ours. It's been a client of ours since 2013. In this engagement, we reviewed over $15 million in annual telecommunications spend. As part of a competitive RFP pitting the major carriers against each other, we generated initially over $2 million in rate reduction savings. But more tellingly, we discovered that the client had been paying $55,000 a month for phone lines that were discontinued or no longer in use. This is the type of detail you pick up at the line item level that you don't see at the aggregate level. This dated back a couple of years, and after doing some exploration and recovery with the carrier, it yielded about $1.3 million in additional credits, which are on top of the $2 million in savings. So again, in this example, simply viewing the spend at the category or vendor level would likely not have discovered this found money, and quite honestly, they probably would be paying the same amount and with almost no end in sight, given the size of the company. Briefly, another quick example that may not entirely please any bankers in the audience. We did find almost $250,000 in overcharges on erroneous bank fees for a very large fast food restaurant operator. After we presented the result, their CFO told us, look, we trusted that the fees we're paying were accurate, shame on us. So it's an example that in almost every category, there are itemized fees and costs and charges that need to be watched. Otherwise, they could be getting away from you. Another best practice is the importance of being open to using new vendors. Most clients of ours have at least a handful of long-standing, protected, what you call sacred cow vendors. While there are certainly merits to having close ties with your vendors, in our view, these relationships can create a complacency that causes companies to miss out on significant savings and high-value offerings from non-incumbent suppliers. In this example, we have a client that's a large, well-known food distributor. They had worked with the same commercial insurance broker for more than 10 years and were very comfortable with that relationship. A new CFO came on board, asked us to get involved in a cost takeout initiative that included a review of the commercial insurance policies and fees they were currently paying their broker. The result was $1 million reduction in premiums and equally as important, an improvement in coverages that weren't being adequately covered. And quite honestly, the long-standing broker didn't feel there was any risk to losing the business. The relationship was very comfortable and friendly. And quite honestly, there was no incentive for the broker to reduce its fees or commissions unless there was some type of competitive event, which we did. Well, in general, about 50 to 60% of all of our savings does come from incumbent vendors. A continual openness to changing vendors is really, really important to balance the success of your relationships with your supply chain. And then the final practice I want to highlight is the importance of effective supplier contract management. Many companies, most companies sign a lot of different contracts with vendors. And a lot of the clients we run into lack the proper visibility of their contractual commitments. As a result, opportunities to capture savings or lost, or worst case, costly surprises arise due to the lack of attention or awareness of those contracts. One common example I think we're all familiar with is the auto renewal clause. If companies don't take proper action, a contract with a supplier auto renews. A 1, 2, 3-year contract can auto renew if certain notice isn't given within 90 or 120 days. And then you're locked into a suboptimal, potentially high-cost relationship without any challenge to what the current market conditions are. So contract review, CEO commitments, measuring the SKU at SKU level, reviewing contracts, and having an openness to working with new vendors are four of the kind of the key successes to continually driving the costs out of your indirect supply chain. So I'd like to spend the final portion of my brief overview addressing steps companies can take in the COVID-19 era. While these steps also apply in a pre-COVID world, they're practical things companies can do, in this new and uncertain and at times quite scary environment. The most important step is to assess the impact COVID is having on your portfolio's major cost categories, whether it's indirect or not. In many areas, the risks and opportunities are price related. In other areas, like PPE equipment, the risk is having access to supply. First, there are some categories where costs are increasing as we speak as a result of the COVID, and your companies certainly need to be aware of that. A great example, again, is the commercial insurance. Certain lines like workers' comp and general liability are seeing double-digit increases as much as 20%. And companies are being hit with some very unpleasant budgetary surprises. Certainly, a strategy there is one of cost avoidance versus cost reduction. In other areas, conversely, like travel and freight, there's downward pressure on pricing due to the lack of or decrease of demand. And now is a great time to negotiate or renegotiate with your vendors in those type of categories. Either way, we highly recommend that companies, whether we're involved or not, do a red, yellow, green analysis of each of the major cost areas. Ask your vendors what they think of is their industry a red, yellow, or green in terms of the directional cost direction. So we highly recommend that that's a key part of kind of an analysis during this COVID environment. Another impact is supply risk, as I mentioned. In certain areas, the availability of key products is tight and with long lead times. And a very popular and common example these days is PPE equipment. As you may recall, PPE products were extremely hard to get in April and May. After some loosening in June, we expect to see lead times extend again as large users like schools and universities reopen and require their constituents to use PPE products. We do have a full line of PPE products. We structured it more on availability as much as a competitive price. And there are other categories that like that you certainly need to do an assessment. Is the availability of supply going to be in any way impacted by COVID? And if so, how? And if so, get the firm contractual or commitment from the suppliers to be able to continue to supply your organization, or find alternative suppliers that can. You know, we realize a lot of companies are struggling right now. One of the things ACC is doing to address this is to provide a confidential, no-cost assessment of a company's spend files. We use this information to develop a savings plan, prioritize categories that we think the savings is achievable short-term, mid-term, long-term, identify any risks in your supply chain, particularly your indirect supply chain, and establish an overall time frame to improve the bottom line impact through cost reduction. We don't charge a fee for this, and we generally turn it around in a couple of weeks. It's a confidential analysis that allows us to have an educated discussion with the company about whether or not it makes sense to initiate a cost reduction effort. Many of you on this call have already requested an analysis. If you have any interest, please contact me after the webinar, and we can discuss the next steps to get that started. So that's my portion of the presentation. Thanks for sparing a few minutes to listen to it. And I'm going to turn it back over to David to curate the panelist discussion.
Thank you very much, Miles. So that does end the formal presentation portion of our program. And now I'd like to move into the discussion portion. Please use the question feature on your control panel to ask questions of our panelists. And let me start off by asking each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, their firms, and also at a high level, introduce the kinds of cost reduction programs that they have in place. Andrew, why don't you get started?
Sure. Thank you, David. Andrew Braithwaite. I'm a managing director with the Cynosure Group. We were originally founded as the investment arm for a fourth and fifth generation family. We have since evolved. We've got a few dozen different families at this point, all investing with us for our direct investments. From a cost management perspective, we've been working with ACC for the past couple of years now. At my prior firm, a large private equity firm, it had an in-house function. We don't have that luxury today. And it's by being able to work with ACC, they're able to take a lot of the heavy lifting off of our plates, off of the plates of the company, and are much more attuned into the day-to-day spend. And so we'll get into more details during the panel, but they have been a pleasure to work with.
Thank you, Andrew. Michael?
Yes, thanks, David. I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the CFO at Fire King Security Group. We manufacture safes for use by retailers, and we service those safes. We are a portfolio company of Thinkston Partners, and we have also worked with Alliance Cost Containment. We have an internal continuous improvement program that is supported by our sponsor to train internal people to run continuous improvement, lean management, Six Sigma type of projects. We have focused on health care, cost containment, as well as driving savings on freight and any number of other just spend related items to try to contain our cost.
Thanks, Michael. Don?
Hello, everybody. Don here, and pleasure to be part of the discussion today. I've been in the private equity world for about 15 years. About 10 of those have been as a CEO. And then about 4 years ago, I joined Snowfips as an operating partner. I tend to put most of my time in the industrial vertical, but I also do some work on the consumer side of the sector as well. So again, happy to be here. And I'd say from a cost reduction perspective, look, I've always had formal cost reduction programs in place. And I think the one thing that I didn't have in place, if I reflect back upon it, is the focus on the indirect. And so I was introduced to Miles and team about 4 years ago. We've worked with them on 2 assignments, and we've been very pleased with the results that we've achieved, and happy to talk further about that as we proceed along the discussions today.
Thank you, Don. All right, before we launch into discussion, I'm going to conduct a quick poll. So I'd like everyone to participate. The question for everyone is, how receptive do you find most management teams when introducing cost reduction initiatives? So just select one of the following answers: very receptive, receptive, resistant, or very resistant. Give you a couple seconds. All right, and see if I can share the results. So a little surprising, over half said that their management teams are receptive, but more than a third said resistant or very resistant. So that continues to be an issue. So let's go to Michael first of all to discuss the results of our polling question. Tell me, first of all, Michael, tell me about the challenges or barriers that you faced internally when implementing cost reduction measures at Fire King Security, and are those polling results consistent with your experience?
Yeah, probably the biggest barrier that we face is just around change, and it's the fear of change. Line level managers ultimately are, they're concerned that there's just some sort of change. Their job's going to become harder. They're going to have to, break bad news to a vendor that they've had a long relationship with. That maybe we're going to come in and see that the company has been overspending in a particular category that they've been responsible for. And really just comes down to one of the things I heard from a number of managers was, don't you trust me? Or this is my job to negotiate with our vendors. And a lot of times we would bring it back and just say, listen, what we're trying to do is get the best price, best service, and free you up to work on what you do best, whether it's marketing or going after, actual procurement or handling freight, making sure packages get to where they need to go on time, not necessarily beating up the supplier for lower cost. And, let us help on that from either the finance side or working with some of our professional partners. And one of the things Miles touched on it earlier was having buy-in from the C-suite. Having the CEO really on board is critical. They really stand behind and say, listen, this is something that we're doing as a firm. This is why we're doing it. And, we need you to be involved. And having support from the private equity sponsor. And when you put up numbers, like every dollar equates to $7 or $10, depending on what your exit multiple is, it's a quick, it's pretty easy to get them on board.
Thanks, Michael. We do have a question from the audience as to whether anyone on the panel has encountered situations where you've reduced costs to a point where they impact revenue or otherwise increase costs in other areas and just started to become counterproductive, I guess. Miles, do you want to take a stab at that one? Any of your clients
certainly
experience that?
I can't say we have. I mean, more often than not, indirect expenses, given the non-core nature, aren't going to have a material impact on revenue if something were to go sideways. That's probably more of an occurrence that would happen in the direct spend area, i.e., if you're sourcing steel and can't get the steel in from the supplier on time, and therefore can't ship your product on time, obviously it's going to have a material effect on revenue. That's less likely on the indirect non-core items, at least in our experience. I don't know if the other panelists see it any differently.
Yeah, Miles, I think that's a really good point. I mean, the great thing about the indirect spend is none of it's customer facing. And so this argument that some people will make around, well, you know, you're going to cause me problems and what are the unintended consequences and all that. But the beauty about indirect spend reduction is it's hard for anybody on a senior team to argue that, you know, that there are real savings potentially there. And what tends to happen is, right, the senior teams are limited by the amount of work they can do on various initiatives. And so when you can bring somebody in like an alliance and who can not only help you do the data mining, but can also, you know, help the team put together the sourcing events, and then they can see firsthand the amount of savings that flow to the P&L. I mean, it's hard to argue that, you know, it's not an easy way to improve the profitability of your business.
I think you've heard a common word throughout, which is non-core. And this is not an area where most of the executive team should be spending their time. And, you know, when you think of your list of initiatives, how much you're paying for copiers and paper should not be taking up executives' time. And to be able to hand that off to somebody that lives and breathes that and can execute on savings, you know, to Don's point, it's hard to argue with.
Yeah, one of the areas.
Go ahead.
Well, one of the areas that we did think long and hard about was freight, because that we've had some experience in the past where, you know, yes, you have a big shiny object out there with potential freight savings, but that ultimately does impact the customer experience if the product's arriving damaged or not on time. So we were very careful when we've evaluated that level of cost.
Mm-hmm.
Miles, a couple of questions for you related to pricing. First is, how does Alliance Cost Containment charge for its services? And then does the expense usually get borne by the private equity firm or the portfolio company in the case of a private equity deal?
Yeah, sure. So our fees are based on verified and delivered savings. So the client always benefits first. And then in all the private equity or all the relationships we've had with PE portfolio companies, in all cases, the portfolio company is paid for our services. Now, when we do a due diligence project on the front end to help go in the data room and see what kind of savings potential there is in a potential acquisition, then in that case, the private equity firm would compensate us for that part at least.
Yeah, and that's Miles. That's my experience as well. That the portfolio company pays for the actual, you know, consulting arrangement. But look, the other point is it's a one-time cost, and right, that just in the savings keep on giving. So it's having that conversation with the CEO and the CFO and just reminding them that, guys, this is a one-time event. Yes, there's cost here and there's cash here, but think about the multiple upon the exit. And you know, you just got to continue to remind them of those things. And by and large, look, they're smart people. They get it pretty quickly, and they endorse it for those reasons.
Don, I want to turn to you at SnowFIPS. Talk about some of the best practices there for getting management teams to buy into cost reduction programs and overcome that resistance that many of the folks in our audience still do encounter.
Yeah, and look, I think you know, look, having been a CEO, been in the seat, I think, you know, you develop a fair amount of empathy and understanding for what the CEO and the CFO and the other senior team members are going through, because right, we're moving quick, time is our enemy, we're trying to get results, and getting them to think, you know, that you can do things concurrently and not and get out of sequential thinking. But that said, CEOs, CFOs don't like to be told what to do, right? And so what you want to work on, in my opinion at least, is educate them, make them aware of the opportunities, and then, arrange the initial meeting with, Miles and his team, because at that point we've created the relationship. They start working together, and very quickly the senior teams see the benefit and the expertise that Miles and his team bring. So I think that's, as an operating partner, right? I'm trying to educate. I'm trying to keep people aware of things, and where I have relationships that I can bring in to help the business, it's an important part of what my responsibilities are.
Any of the other panelists with some suggestions on that front?
I would say, or go ahead, Andrew. Sorry.
No problem. I would just add to Don's comment, and I'll personalize it a little bit. Most of our investments end up being minority investments where we're not in a control position, so our ability to quote unquote dictate is non-existent. And so it's the interpersonal relationship with the executive team. It's the raising of questions of, hey, have you ever thought of, and the more you can position it as their initiative or their idea, the more buy-in you get. And so sitting down with, whether it's CFO, CEO, saying, hey, I saw this, do you think it's worth meeting with Miles? Or how have you thought about that in the past? And kind of the more you can frame it in a way that they can take ownership of it, they end up buying in much quicker. And it doesn't seem like a dictation so much as just a collaboration. And the more you can collaborate, I think the smoother it goes.
Andrew, I want to stay with you because I know that you've embarked on a couple of cost reduction programs recently. I wonder if you would just walk us through some of the reasons why you've done that and why you were originally interested in doing it.
Yeah, it should hopefully be obvious at this point, which is you've got an opportunity to create value, even if it's small, by taking care of non-core items and having someone else do all the heavy lifting. And the piece that I think Don and Michael have touched on, where there is resistance, it's a little bit of just inertia. And the more you can remove that barrier, hand it to somebody else, let them run with it, the easier it is. And if you're able to increase EBITDA by 1%, 2%, 3%, 10%, whatever that number is, without taking up any executive time, and have someone else who lives and breathes this on a daily basis, why wouldn't you want to do it? And one of the other things that Miles touched on was supplier risk, in the sense of you've got some non-core functions. Maybe you've got a relationship with only one person, and maybe they went bankrupt during COVID. Having someone that can slot somebody else in relatively quickly, having that support staff, and being able to lean on Miles and his team when you need it is quite beneficial. And that's the reason why we've gone down that path. To Michael's point, there are a couple of things on that list that for some businesses will start to feel more core-like, and will touch the customer and revenue. And we've had that come up, and we've just stayed away from it. And not forcing executives or coercing executives to do things that they feel core, but just stick to the things on that list that are non-core and grow the relationship over time. So that's why we've done it, and it's been fruitful thus far.
Thanks, Andrew. Michael, I want to turn to you. At Fire King Security Group, have there been any surprises, pleasant, unpleasant, when implementing cost reduction programs there?
Yeah, of course. So there's always opportunities where you're learning along the way, and sometimes you're going to learn some really good, and sometimes it'll be not quite as good or more eye-opening. Some of the pleasant surprises, maybe one of the best, was just the fact that we could really keep a lot of our existing vendors and wind up in a lower cost position. a lot of the utility bills, for instance, those are kind of easy to pick on. They have a way of just attracting like a magnet, just extra fees and taxes and all kinds of stuff along the way. And AP is processing hundreds of invoices every day, so their ability to look at it at the fine-tooth level, it's almost non-existent. And they don't even necessarily know exactly what to look for in some of these obscure, fees or taxes. So, having somebody like ACC come in who can really run it through an actual model, it really helps to, cut costs that creeped in over time and doesn't have any impact on the business. And Miles mentioned it. We had any number of phone lines. We didn't have the volume that his telecom client did, but we had any number of telephone lines that should have gotten cut off, and for whatever reason, somebody thought they were, but we came to find out during the analysis that they weren't. So that was an easy thing to correct and save money on instantly. Some of the other things that become a little more challenging are when you have process improvement, and some of that could be internal that you're running. The folks who are going to run that process on a day-to-day, they need to be bought in, and the time really has to be right for them to kind of accept it. And so getting them involved in the process, we had a large improvement program a couple of years ago to improve the quality of shipments and to reduce the number of returns for damage. And we got many of the production folks involved in being part of the solution. Therefore, they bought in when it came time to actually implement the solution, and we realized a substantial amount of savings.
I'll tell you one from my perspective. One, I guess, pleasant surprise that sometimes our clients see is inevitably in an engagement. We'll get into it and we'll find a category where we can't find savings, and we honestly, even though we're not in any way rewarded for that, we don't view that as bad news. We try to figure out why has the client and how has the client found the optimal spot in the market for this particular category. We certainly want to advocate the stakeholder internally who's led that charge and try to the extent possible encourage the client to replicate that on their own without our help. And that's something that I think sometimes our clients are maybe not surprised with, but they expect if we come in to cut costs that we're going to do it in every category, and that's not always the case.
Yeah,
hey, Miles,
we had that exact experience.
Go ahead, Michael.
No, I was just confirming. We did have that experience in a handful of categories. So it was nice that Miles' team said, listen, we're not going to go after something that's not there.
Hey, Miles, back to you. We have a question that just came in from the audience related to how the process of evaluating opportunities for cost reduction differs in a small versus a mid-sized company, and what have been some of the most interesting opportunities for cost reduction that you've found?
I'm not sure the process differs, whether it's small, medium, or large company. We have a very disciplined, scientific, and proven approach of doing a deep dive, starting in the AP file, looking at all vendors, every dollar spent, categorizing it, and coming up with, based on benchmarks and current market trends, et cetera, what we think the opportunity is, low to high. At that point, the savings, whether it's a small savings, mid-sized savings, or large savings, both parties decide if it makes sense to move forward. So the process of kind of analyzing it doesn't change. And I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of that question? I was too fixed.
So the second part was, what has been one of the most interesting opportunities for cost reduction that you found in your history of doing it?
Most interesting, I think kind of along the lines of the case studies we put in, some of these overcharges that just go undiscovered for months and years, that you would think the supplier would have the discipline and the reporting systems to correct on their own, because the clients don't have the resources to do so. To your point about chasing down every invoice, that's always kind of baffled me a little bit, and so the overcharges on the unused telephone lines, the utility bills, the bank fees. We have a couple of engagements right now where we're implementing recovery and overcharges on bank statements. You would think fundamentally that just wouldn't occur, and that's outside of a rate negotiation or negotiating new services or improved terms or any of that. The other thing that's interesting is there are continually new offerings in these various supply categories, as non-core as they are, which kind of underscores the importance of being open-minded to considering new vendors. Because if a client is closed-minded and will only work with certain vendors in an area, the competitors catch wind of that, and they start to lose interest in promoting their offering to the client, and in a kind of a strange way, it ends up limiting the client's potential options, if you will. So those are a couple of the, I guess, more interesting tidbits that seem to be consistently apparent with some of our engagements.
Thanks, Miles. So we're getting really good questions coming in from the audience. I'd just like to encourage even more. So on your control panel, you have a question feature, and please just continue to send in your questions. Donald, I'm going to turn to you. At Snow Phipps, do you apply a systematic approach to expense reduction across the entire portfolio, or do you take things on a company-by-company basis? How does that work?
Sure, and I'm well aware of many PE firms that do consolidate their spend and leverage the total spend of the portfolio companies and do it quite effectively. We don't have an all-encompassing formal program by which we leverage the total spend of the portfolio companies, but we do a lot of internal benchmarking, and we share that information amongst the portfolio companies if and when we think it makes sense to do so.
Okay. Miles, a question for you.
Yeah, I was just gonna. Another point I wanted to make is and I think is important. Every one of these portfolio companies is in a little bit different place in terms of the holding period and where they are in their various initiatives. And as Miles will tell you, I mean, a lot of the big events and particularly cost reduction is in earlier phases of the investment hold period.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Miles, question just came in for you. I'll just read it as it's written. How painful is it to secure an initial analysis, and how much company staff time is needed to support implementation for a cost reduction program?
Sure. So the initial analysis is very non-invasive. It generally takes, it literally, we can get the report. Companies typically can get the report to us in the same day. We send just a very simple one-pager over specifying what we need, and we'll sign a non-disclosure. So that part is straightforward. In terms of the client's time, it takes us about 2 weeks of doing our analysis to come back to the client with a preliminary savings assessment. And again, as I said earlier, that's prior to any commitment by the client. In terms of client time, we actually started to measure it a little bit. On the front end, it's important that we get with the C-suite and understand the level of buy-in they have and commitment, because the more that they advocate what we're doing from the top, the less time is going to be required downstream. Generally speaking, if we've done our engagement right, we shouldn't expect more than maybe an hour a week per staff time throughout the course of an engagement. And that doesn't include key decision milestones where you may have, an hour and a half meeting or or something of that nature. So, I mean, we have three levels of our partnership team that comes in. An executive engagement partner leads the effort. We have an expert in every category that's in the scope. So we have a tier of category experts. Then we have a team of data analysts underneath them. And then separate from that, we have an audit team. So we try to staff it so that it's really set up so that the client spends as much or as little time as they wish. But again, on the front end, kind of taking the gauge, is this a nice to have from the C-suite, or is it a kind of a must have? And we try to understand the level of buy-in, and that we'll communicate clearly. That dictates downstream the amount of time it may take to get this thing pushed through.
And Michael, a question for you. What's kind of the key to maintaining discipline after the initial engagement so that over a long period of time, the management team stays on board with the cost reduction program and you don't lose your early gains?
Yeah, so Miles touched on it in his presentation. His firm, they on a monthly basis, they are doing an audit of every single line that, you know, in the categories where they're tracking the save. In fact, they're actually even tracking it on some of the categories where they don't wind up getting paid, like I think like coffee and some of those types of things. So we see how much money we ultimately saved. So it's there in black and white every single month. We know, you know, we see the results. And if I recall right, you know, the initial period is 24 months. So, you know, Miles and team are staying on it, you know, consistently month after month. As we come, you know, to that period, you know, probably 12 to 15 months from now, we'll likely, you know, run through a couple of other categories and just make sure that, you know, things haven't crept back in. It's also raised the awareness of members of our team, whether they're on the IT team or AP or some of the other departments, for them to be looking at the cost. And, you know, those are the folks that are on the front line. They have quick view and they know pretty quickly if something doesn't feel or smell right in terms of cost, or maybe there's a way that we could potentially save costs. So this exercise has really helped raise the awareness of folks so that, you know, they're all looking out for ways for us to save a few dollars, or turns out a lot of times it's a lot of dollars over one period of time. I would second kind of what Miles was talking about in terms of commitment. Just going back to the earlier question, when the team came in, it was very, very minimal effort on our team. We handed over boxes and boxes of paper, and the ACC team sent in an army of folks to do their own scanning of these data or all of the invoices. They spent hours on site, but our folks, their involvement was pointing towards the box, and Miles and his team diligently went about their efforts of collecting the data and then analyzing it. So the front side effort is pretty easy lifting for the management team and really for the frontline folks.
Don, at Snow Phipps, what kind of initial due diligence can be done in the pre-acquisition phase to identify areas of excess costs or fat that could come out of your target companies?
Yeah, David, it's a big part of our diligence, as you can imagine. So we'll obviously push very hard to get as much data as we can from those companies, and then we'll use that data and use our data and come up with the estimates for what we believe to be the synergy cost savings potential. And look, we've done, I'll use one example, we've done 3 bolt-ons since we bought our platform business. And in every case, the synergy savings on both materials and services ended up being pretty significant. And we ended up being fairly close to our original assumption. So it starts with Obviously, the trick there is getting the companies that are on the market, getting them to provide you that data, which can sometimes get a little bit tricky. But yeah, it's a big part of what we do, and it's an important part of due diligence, of course.
Okay, and let me turn to Michael at Fire King Security. We had a similar question earlier, but I think it's worth revisiting, and that's how do you prevent cost reductions from creating a negative dynamic anywhere else in the business, such as new business generation or other areas?
Well, Don hit on it earlier. Most of these categories are non-core. So, we're not impacting somebody's travel budget. We're not impacting the way we go about marketing. We're merely working to lower the cost per piece of collateral. Yet the piece of collateral is still on a high quality paper with high quality ink. It's a world-class supplier. We just wind up with a lower price per unit. So ultimately, none of these things really impact our ability to get out in front of a customer or, the potential customer. So we haven't experienced that to any degree. It hasn't held us back at all.
Andrew, I want to turn to you. And again, you've got some initiatives underway in cost reduction. What insights into your portfolio company's operations have you gotten from those projects that you're doing?
I think the overarching one is the inertia is real. And so despite Miles doing a lot of the heavy lifting, any sort of change comes with some level of pushback, even if they know it's the right thing to do, even if they buy into it, it doesn't necessarily always come to the top of the list. And look, we've got one example of that right now where one of our portfolio companies is busier than ever because of COVID. They're also doing a couple of M&A transactions in the middle of this as well, and they had to put on hold some of the cost save initiatives just because of bandwidth. And despite trying to take as much of that off of their plate, it still takes a little bit of time. You still need buy-in on it. And going back to Don's point earlier, you can't jam this down people's throats to do. You need buy-in for it. And so that's been one kind of eye-opening piece, which is the inertia is real, but most people ultimately come around. We've seen them come around. And the second is, you have to go into it, and this is hard, particularly with management, that there can be no sacred cows. And Miles touched on that before. Even pieces that you feel like start to creep into core, it's worth a conversation. Even if it doesn't lead to expense savings, even if it doesn't lead to changing vendors, it's just a good housekeeping practice, and it starts to filter into the culture. It filters into just an awareness or an assessment of where dollars are going. And, all too often you just get in the habit of going with the same vendor or paying the same bill, and you never stop and ask why. And so that's been eye-opening as well. There's been a couple of items that start to end up on the fringes of core that have led to some really fruitful conversations. Some will lead to vendor changes, some won't, but it's led to some very fruitful conversations. So that's been eye-opening as well.
Miles, question for you. In terms of calculating the savings, this attendee would like to know what the savings calculated is based on, or what is the savings calculated based on and or verified against? Can you get into that at all?
Yes, certainly. That's a great question. So we go to painstakingly detailed to establish a very, very deep and robust baseline of costs, price baseline, service baseline, of how the client has been, of their costs prior to us getting involved. And generally that's the trailing 12, 18, 24 months. We also review all contracts. In some cases, we'll actually review specifications of products. So we'll establish an exact baseline that shows their purchasing behavior. And then we measure the post-baseline savings results, or the savings results against that baseline. If there's an area where there's raw material volatility, we'll index it. So, any changes in raw material prices that would have occurred either way, whether we were involved or not, are indexed. So the baseline stays valid and current.
Okay, and we have about 15 minutes left in the program, and we'll answer your questions as they come in. Just use your control panel, the question menu bar, and fire away. Don, I want to turn to you, especially in the first 180 days of ownership of a portfolio company at SnowFips, that critical period of time. How do you prioritize cost reduction initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, David, and for the folks on, that are participating in the call, I mean, we all know you got to get out of the gates quickly, whether or not we want to call it the 180-day plan, 100-day plan, but it's recognition that, you've got to start to, achieve the full potential of that business as quickly as possible. And so for us, it comes down to, right, what are the critical few? Where does the data take you? And balancing risk versus reward. But clearly, this is always a top priority for any business that we're involved with, is where are the opportunities and how do we achieve them as quickly as possible. And again, I think what's neat about this particular area is every management team only has so much bandwidth. So when we can bring in outside resources to help achieve some of these opportunities, and then it allows us just to go that much faster. So anyway, those are my comments that come to mind.
David, can I just add one thing?
Go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, I would just add that the more of the 100-day plan conversation around expense savings you can have before the 100-day plan kicks off, so before the transaction closes, I think the better. People's mind frames and mentalities are in a slightly different place going into a closing of a transaction versus the big moment post closing a transaction. And if you're trying to ramp up an item that is important but not necessarily in the top 5 priorities, it's better to do it when everyone is revved up, not when everyone is shifting focus to the top priorities of the 100-day plan, if that makes sense.
Right. And on the flip side, what about that last 180 days when you're trying to prepare a company for sale and it's important to get EBITDA as high as possible? Does that change how you prioritize cost reduction initiatives? Again, Don?
Geez, yeah, I mean, if you're that late in the investment hold period, obviously at that point, hopefully you've initiated and executed most of these initiatives, and you're getting the full benefit to the P&L on a last 12 months, trailing 12 months basis. So at that point, you should be operating on all cylinders, and you want to make sure that obviously you're maintaining those gains, you're not giving any of them up, and that they consistently are flowing through to the P&L. So I don't know if any of the other guys have a different thought or answer on that last 180-day period.
I will say, Don, from our perspective, and certainly you guys know better than we do. I mean, you get involved in the quality of earnings exercise, and from our standpoint, it's a quality of savings exercise. So we want to take the work that's already been implemented and maybe not yet materialized, and make sure that's measured to the point where the PE firm client of ours can factor that in and utilize that in the increased valuations. Because if you're not tracking that savings, it still could be there, but if you're not tracking it, you can't. It's really hard to almost justify it in the exit strategy as a value adder.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to your point, it's got to be real. I mean, people aren't paying you for gimmicky potential savings, right? They're paying you for the actual results of the business.
I don't know why you wouldn't do it, even if it's towards the finish line. And I think having a third party be the arbiter of savings gives it some credibility in the buyer's eyes. I think if you were to do it yourself and just say, hey, this was an expense saved we've just ignored for the last 5 years, but we're going to all of a sudden do it now, people kind of look at that and say, well, you were an idiot for not doing it for the last 5 years. If you said, hey, we brought in a third party, they've done an expense assessment, they've validated, they're gonna track it, it gives it some more credence. You might not get paid dollar for dollar for it, but I think you've got a better chance of getting something for it than if you just did it on your own.
Yeah, fair enough.
Michael, what are some unanticipated costs associated with COVID-19 that you've had to contend with, and how have you dealt with those costs?
Yeah, so David, one of kind of coming out of the gate in March, early March, before COVID really started to take off, we operated pretty much a all in the office workforce. So really quickly in the month of March, we had to go out and secure a whole lot of laptop computers and extra monitors, and more or less turn a stationary workforce into a remote workforce in the course of roughly a week. So that was a cost, even as we were midway through the quarter, really didn't look like it was going to be a huge thing to us. There is the obvious PPE, additional cleaning costs because we have kept our offices open. So we do want the office and the hard surfaces more sterilized at a higher rate and more frequently than they have been. So we incurred costs there. Credit risk is becoming even bigger. So you've got the amount of bankruptcies that are beginning to come through the pipe right now is increasing by the day. That's going to wind up resulting in additional expense and less cash that's coming in. Customers are slowing their payments down, therefore, raising your cost of carrying the receivable. We're seeing the increase in cost in our freight right now. So our small package shipping, our vendor won't guarantee that packages will get there unless they're sent overnight. We don't need to send them all overnight, but we have to send them all overnight in order to get, to make sure that they're going to arrive. Otherwise, the best that the carrier will guarantee is a week to 10 days. And that doesn't do us any good from a customer service perspective. So, those are just some of the ones on the surface. There's obviously some level of productivity. Some folks are much more productive at home. Some are a lot less because their work environment it just isn't good. They're sitting on their couch trying to do work versus sitting in the office where they could be close by their teammates. So there's a lot of those things. A number of firms had layoffs. And so if you paid out severance, then you had a cost associated with severance. Whether you treat it as an add back or not, it was a cash cost that you didn't necessarily anticipate. Those were some of the ones that we faced throughout the process.
Okay, we have time for about one more question, and I think I'll give Miles the final word as our sponsor. We have a question about just the typical timeline from engagement of your services to actually seeing savings on the bottom line. Can you speak to how long it takes?
Sure, it does vary by category. As a rule, we like to have A to Z, everything implemented within 6 months of getting started. Some categories you can turn it pretty quickly inside of 3 months. Others, particularly some categories, maybe like a packaging or freight, where it requires more of a white glove treatment, and also where you might be replacing an incumbent vendor, that could trend toward the latter part of that time frame. And then one other thing, and I kind of alluded to it, we can get into a category, and oftentimes we'll get in and find out that a client has a binding contract that they weren't aware of. Obviously, that's going to throw the time frame out. But as a rule, everything else being equal, inside of 6 months.
Okay. Any of the other panelists with a final thought on just how long it takes to see results?
Yeah, just in my experience, working with the 2 portfolio companies that Miles and his team work with, it was quite quick. I mean, you're not doing it all big bang. I mean, as opportunities come up, they're out actively negotiating, and as soon as those savings are realized, they're trickling through the P&L. So it's pretty quick in both cases.
All right, I'm afraid we are just about out of time, so I'd like to thank Private Equity Professional for being a great partner in producing this webinar. I'd like to thank our speakers for doing a fantastic job with the program. Andrew Braithwaite of Sinisher Group, Miles Lee of Alliance Cost Containment, Michael Lynch of Fire King Security Group, and Don Sturdivant of Snow Phipps. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Alliance Cost Containment, for making the program possible. Please do take a moment to fill out a very brief 2-question survey before you sign off, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.